Behind the stone walls of European cathedrals and palaces, an organization shrouded in mystery and legend was hidden for centuries. Freemasonry, a brotherhood that emerged from medieval guilds of builders, eventually transformed into an intellectual movement uniting people of different social strata and beliefs. These ideas penetrated Russia under Peter the Great, when the empire eagerly absorbed European innovations. The compass and square, acacia and trowel. These symbols became part of a secret language, understandable only to the initiated. Masonic lodges, with their rituals, degrees of initiation, and oaths of loyalty, created a parallel space where a nobleman and a merchant could call each other brothers. The Freemasons, as they called themselves, strived for moral perfection and the construction of a temple of human virtues. However, behind the noble goals, many saw political ambitions and conspiracies. From St. Petersburg to Moscow, from imperial palaces to the estates of provincial nobles, Freemasonry spread, attracting the most educated people of its time. It became not just a secret society, but a force that influenced the course of Russian history. The path of Freemasonry in Russia is a story of ascents and falls, from imperial patronage to persecution, from enlightenment to revolutionary ideas, culminating in the fall of the monarchy and the demise of the last Romanovs. The first Masonic ideas penetrated Russia along with the wind of change that Peter the Great brought from the shores of Europe. The year 1698 became a turning point. It was then that the young Tsar, eager for knowledge and innovation, embarked on his famous Grand Embassy. In foggy London and prim Amsterdam, Peter not only mastered the science of shipbuilding, but also made acquaintance with people whose ideas were shaping a new Europe. Among them were members of Masonic lodges, the intellectual elite of that time. It is not known for certain whether Peter himself was initiated into Freemasonry, as some historians claim. However, his close circle consisting of foreigners undoubtedly had connections with European lodges. Lefort, Gordon, Bruce, these names became symbols of a new Russia, open to Western influences. They brought with them not only technical knowledge, but also new forms of social connections, among which was Freemasonry. The first official Masonic lodge on Russian soil appeared in 1731, after Peter's death. Its founder was the Scot James Keith, a general in the Russian army and future Field Marshal of Prussia. Captain of the Guard John Phillips was elected the first master of the lodge. This lodge, operating under the English system, united predominantly foreigners, officers, diplomats, merchants. The Russian nobility initially regarded the mysterious gatherings, where people of different social strata called each other brothers, with caution. However, gradually the ideas of equality, brotherhood, and moral self-improvement began to resonate with educated Russians. Freemasonry offered an alternative to both ecclesiastical dogmatism and crude materialism. A path of spiritual search, clothed in exquisite symbolism and rituals. Peter's reforms created fertile ground for the spread of Freemasonry. The Europeanization imposed, from above, the creation of a new elite based not on lineage, but on service to the state, the weakening of the Church's influence. All this contributed to the acceptance of Masonic ideas. The Freemasons spoke of building a temple of virtue in every person's soul, a metaphor that perfectly corresponded to Peter's desire to rebuild Russia according to a new model. It is symbolic that the first Masonic meetings took place in St. Petersburg, a city erected by Peter's will as a symbol of New Russia. This city, built according to a regular plan with its straight avenues and European architecture, itself resembled a Masonic project. The rational transformation of chaos into cosmos, the triumph of human reason over the elements. In the homes of the St. Petersburg nobility, items with Masonic symbols began to appear. Rings with the image of a compass and square, snuff boxes with acacia, books bound in a special way. Freemasonry became a fashion, a sign of belonging to a progressive circle of people looking to the West. However, in the Petrine era, Freemasonry remained a peripheral phenomenon, an exotic flower on harsh Russian soil. The true flourishing awaited the Freemasons in the future, when the ideas of the Enlightenment would penetrate deeper into Russian society. Nevertheless, the first stone in the foundation of Russian Freemasonry was laid precisely under Peter, the reforming Tsar, who himself, like a Mason, sought to hew the rough stone of Russian reality, giving it a form worthy of a great power. Catherine the Great ascended to the throne in 1762, and from that moment began the golden age of Russian Freemasonry. The educated and enlightened empress, who corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, was initially favorably disposed towards the Masons. During her reign, Masonic lodges flourished, transforming from exotic foreign clubs into centers of intellectual and spiritual life in Russian society. In St. Petersburg and Moscow, new lodges opened one after another. Urania, Astrea, Osiris, Harmony, 9 Muses. Freemasonry attracted the best minds of the era, writers, philosophers, and statesmen. Among the Russian Masons of the Catherine era, we find the names of Ivan Yelagin, Nikolai Novikov, Ivan Schwartz, Nikolai Karamzin, and Alexander Radishchev. In 1771, Ivan Perfilyevich Yelagin received a patent from the Grand Lodge of England to lead all Russian lodges. The Yelagin system became the first attempt to unite the disparate Masonic organizations of Russia under a single leadership. The lodges of the Yelagin system operated according to the English Rite, focusing on the ethical aspects of Freemasonry and philanthropy. However, a real revolution in Russian Freemasonry occurred with the appearance on the scene of Nikolai Ivanovich Novikov, an outstanding enlightener, publisher, and public figure. Becoming a Mason in 1775, Novikov quickly became a central figure in Moscow Freemasonry. He saw in Freemasonry not just a secret society with beautiful rituals, but a powerful tool for the moral transformation of society. Together with Johann Georg Schwartz, a professor at Moscow University, Novikov created a special movement, the Moscow Rosicrucians, or Martinists. This system, based on the teachings of the French mystic Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, combined Masonic rituals with a deep study of esoteric philosophy and Christian mysticism. The Moscow Martinists created a true educational empire. The printing house of Moscow University, leased by Novikov, published hundreds of books, from children's textbooks to complex philosophical treatises. The quote, founded by Masons, became a center for the dissemination of knowledge. It operated a translation seminary, a library, and a bookstore. In the midst of the famine of 1787, Moscow Masons organized a large-scale charitable campaign, distributing bread and opening free canteens for the starving. This was a practical implementation of Masonic ideals of brotherly love and mutual assistance. However, the golden age of Russian Freemasonry proved to be short-lived. The French Revolution of 1789 changed Catherine's attitude towards the Masons. The Empress, frightened by the revolutionary events, began to see a potential threat in the Masons. Their secret meetings, international ties, talk of equality and brotherhood, all this now seemed suspicious. In 1792, Novikov was arrested and imprisoned in Schlisselburg Fortress. His printing house was closed, books confiscated, and many deemed harmful and burned. The formal reason for the arrest was the publication of books without censorship, but the true reason was the fear of Masonic influence. Masonic lodges were not officially banned, but their activities were paralyzed. Many brothers preferred to put their lodges to sleep, a Masonic term for ceasing operations. Others went deep underground, continuing to meet secretly in a narrow circle of initiates. The Catherine era showed all the contradictions in the relationship between Freemasonry and state power in Russia. Beginning with patronage and flourishing, it ended with persecution. However, it was during this time that Freemasonry took deep root in Russian culture and social thought. The Rosicrucians of the Catherine era created a special atmosphere of spiritual quests that influenced many generations of Russian thinkers. Their libraries, full of hermetic and mystical texts, their alchemical laboratories, their philosophical conversations, formed a unique intellectual space where Western rationalism met Eastern wisdom, and scientific knowledge met spiritual practices. In the quiet of the Masonic lodges, ideas were born that would later emerge into the broad public arena. Here, under the veil of secrecy, Russian society learned to think independently, going beyond the framework of official ideology and church dogmas. Here, civil society was formed, albeit an elite, closed one, but already aware of its separation from the state. The murder of Paul I in 1801 marked a turning point not only for the Russian monarchy, but also for the Masonic movement. The new emperor, Alexander I, raised in the spirit of Enlightenment ideals, began his reign with liberal reforms. One of his first steps was the release of Nikolai Novikov from the Schlisselburg fortress, where he had spent 4 long years by order of Catherine the Great. Novikov was released physically broken, but not spiritually. Although he himself did not return to active Masonic activities, his release became a symbolic gesture, signifying the revival of Freemasonry in Russia. Masonic lodges, which had fallen asleep in the last years of Catherine's reign, gradually began to awaken. Alexander I, unlike his grandmother, did not see Masons as a threat. Moreover, his own spiritual quests often led him to circles close to Freemasonry. The young emperor, tormented by guilt over his indirect involvement in the conspiracy against his father, sought solace not only in state affairs, but also in mystical teachings. In the first decade of Alexander's reign, Masonic lodges experienced a true renaissance. In 1810, the influential lodge Polar Star was founded, uniting many prominent figures of the era. Among Russian Masons of this period, we find ministers, senators, generals, writers, and scientists. Particularly noteworthy is the figure of Prince Alexander Nikolaevich Golitsyn, a close friend of the emperor, Ober-Procurator of the Holy Synod, and later Minister of Spiritual Affairs and Public Education. Golitsyn, known for his mystical inclinations, became a link between Masonic circles and the supreme power. Paradoxically, it was the Orthodox Ober-Procurator who patronized various mystical currents, including Freemasonry. With his assistance, the writings of Western mystics, Eckartshausen, Jungstilling, Böhm, were disseminated in Russia. Golitsyn created the Bible Society, whose goal was the translation and distribution of Holy Scripture, but which in practice became a center of attraction for Masons and mystics of all stripes. Alexander I himself, after the victory over Napoleon, delved deeper into mysticism. The famous Baroness Krudener, who considered herself a prophetess, had a huge influence on the emperor. Under her influence, the idea of the Holy Alliance was born, a mystical brotherhood of monarchs called to establish a kingdom of justice on earth. In this idea, Masonic motifs of universal brotherhood and moral improvement are easily discernible. However, the relationship between Freemasonry and the throne remained complex and ambiguous. While at the beginning of Alexander's reign, Masons enjoyed almost official patronage, after the Patriotic War of 1812, the situation began to change. Patriotic fervor contributed to the growth of nationalistic sentiments, and Freemasonry, with its cosmopolitanism and Western roots, aroused increasing suspicion. Moreover, the Masonic lodges themselves were not homogeneous. Alongside moderate and loyal lodges, there were also more radical ones. Some of them, especially those associated with army circles, gradually became politicized. In them, discussions were increasingly heard not only about moral improvement, but also about the need for political change. In 1822, upon learning of the political activities of some lodges, Alexander I issued a decree prohibiting all secret societies, including Masonic ones. This step was part of a general turn towards conservatism, characteristic of the late period of Alexander's reign. Many Masons accepted the ban with understanding and submitted to the imperial will. Others went underground or reoriented themselves towards political activity, joining the ranks of emerging Decembrist organizations. Thus, Freemasonry, conceived as a brotherhood for moral improvement, gradually became a breeding ground for political radicalism. The Decembrist uprising on Senate Square on December 14, 1825, became the culmination of a long process of transforming Masonic ideals into a political program. The path from philosophical discussions in the quiet of Masonic lodges to open confrontation with autocracy was difficult and inevitable. Freemasonry, with its ideas of equality, brotherhood, and moral improvement, created a fertile ground for the formation of a revolutionary consciousness. The first secret political organizations in Russia, the Union of Salvation and the Union of Welfare, were founded by individuals who had passed through the Masonic school. Their structure, rituals, system of initiation degrees, and oaths of allegiance were directly borrowed from Masonic experience. Even the names of these societies reflected Masonic symbolism. The salvation of humanity and the welfare of peoples had always been among the highest goals of the Freemasons. Pavel Ivanovich Pestel, author of the radical Russkaya Pravda, was initiated into Freemasonry in the St. Petersburg Lodge, United Friends. Prince Sergei Petrovich Trubetskoy, chosen as the dictator of the uprising, was a member of the Lodge Three Virtues. Nikita Mikhailovich Muravyov, who wrote a more moderate constitutional project, was a member of the Lodge Three Crowned Swords. Almost all leaders of the Decembrist movement passed through Masonic organizations. The foreign campaigns of the Russian army in 1813 to 1814 played a decisive role in the politicization of Freemasonry. Young officers who entered Paris as victors were struck by the contrast between European freedoms and Russian serfdom. In France and Germany, they visited local Masonic lodges, where they absorbed not only esoteric knowledge, but also revolutionary ideas. Polish Masonic organizations, which already had a pronounced political character, exerted a particularly strong influence. Many Decembrists serving in Poland established close ties with their Polish brethren. The idea of a federal structure for future Russia, reflected in Nikita Muravyov's constitutional project, was largely inspired by Polish experience. When, in 1822, Alexander I banned all secret societies, including Masonic lodges, many Masons faced a choice: obey the imperial will or continue their activities underground. Moderate brethren preferred to put their lodges to sleep, while more radical ones transformed Masonic gatherings into political organizations. Thus, the northern and southern societies of the Decembrists emerged. While retaining the outward attributes of Freemasonry, secrecy, hierarchy, initiation rituals, they imbued them with new, revolutionary content. If traditional Freemasonry aimed at the gradual moral improvement of man and society, the Decembrists yearned for immediate political change. Pavel Pestel, who led the Southern Society, underwent the most radical evolution. From Masonic ideals of brotherhood, he arrived at a Jacobin program of revolutionary dictatorship. His Russkaya Pravda envisioned not only the abolition of autocracy and serfdom, but also the establishment of a republic with strong, centralized power. To achieve these goals, Pestel considered any means permissible, including regicide and temporary dictatorship. The Northern Society, led by Nikita Muravyov and Prince Trubetskoy, retained more ties to the Masonic tradition. Their constitutional project envisioned a constitutional monarchy along the English model, a federal state structure, and the gradual liberation of peasants. This moderate approach reflected the influence of Masonic gradualism, the idea of gradual societal improvement. It is symbolic that the Decembrist uprising occurred during an interregnum, a sacred moment for Masons of transition from chaos to a new order. The death of Alexander I in November 1825 and the subsequent oath to Constantine and then to Nicholas created a situation of uncertainty that the conspirators decided to exploit. The troops were led to Senate Square under the pretext of defending the rights of the legitimate heir Constantine. This was a typical Masonic tactic, to use legitimist rhetoric for revolutionary purposes. However, the rebels did not dare to take active action, and their supposed dictator, Prince Trubetskoy, did not appear on the square. By evening, the uprising was suppressed by grapeshot. The investigation into the Decembrist affair revealed the Masonic roots of the conspiracy. Nicholas I, who personally interrogated many prisoners, was struck by the scale of Masonic influence. The five main conspirators, Pestel, Ryliev, Muravyov Apostol, Bestuzhev Ryumin, and Kakovsky, were hanged. Over 100 people were sent to Siberian exile. Masonic lodges were banned even more strictly than before. The tragedy of the Decembrists demonstrated the full complexity of transforming philosophical ideals into political practice. Freemasonry, conceived as a brotherhood for moral improvement, gave rise to a political movement that attempted to change Russia through revolutionary means. This path proved premature and ended in defeat, but it paved the way for future generations of revolutionaries. Masonic ideas of equality, brotherhood, and freedom, refracted through the experience of the Decembrists, entered the genetic code of the Russian revolutionary movement. Even decades later, when the Narodniks and socialists appeared on the political stage, the Masonic legacy, secret societies, oaths of allegiance, a system of initiations, and a belief in the possibility of building an ideal society could be discerned in their organizations and methods. December 14, 1825, marked not only the collapse of the Decembrist uprising, but also the dawn of a new era in the history of Russian Freemasonry. Nicholas I, who ascended the throne through blood on Senate Square, viewed secret societies as a direct threat to state order. The new emperor, unlike his brother Alexander, harbored no sympathies for mystical teachings or esoteric circles. He was a man of military discipline and strict regulation. On April 21, 1826, an imperial decree followed, categorically prohibiting all secret societies within the Russian Empire. The decree explicitly emphasized that the ban extended to Masonic lodges, under whatever name they might exist. Violators faced severe punishment, from demotion and exile to penal servitude. Enforcement of the decree was overseen by the recently established Third Section of His Imperial Majesty's own Chancellery, the first political police in Russian history. This institution was headed by Count Alexander Christophorovich Benkendorf, a loyal associate of Nicholas, a man who personally interrogated many Decembrists and well understood the connection between Freemasonry and revolutionary ideas. Agents of the Third Section infiltrated various social circles, searching for traces of Masonic activity. Mail censorship, covert surveillance, denunciations, all these methods were used to uncover secret gatherings. Special attention was paid to former members of Masonic lodges, their contacts and movements. Many Masons, especially high-ranking officials and military personnel, hastened to publicly renounce their Masonic past. They signed special, quote, pledging never again to participate in the activities of secret societies. These documents were stored in the archives of the Third Section as a kind of compromising material, guaranteeing the loyalty of the signatories. Even the famous poet Alexander Pushkin, who had connections with Masonic circles, was forced to give the emperor a personal promise not to participate in secret societies. Nicholas I, who became the poet's personal censor, closely monitored his every move. However, despite the strict prohibitions and persecutions, Freemasonry did not completely disappear. It went deep underground, transformed, and acquired new forms. Some lodges continued to meet secretly in private homes, disguising their gatherings as friendly parties or literary salons. Others moved their activities abroad, maintaining contact with Russian brethren through secret correspondence and trusted couriers. Russian Masonic lodges were particularly active in Paris and London, where many political emigrants from Russia found refuge. Here they freely interacted with European Freemasons, exchanged ideas, and planned the future revival of Freemasonry in their homeland. In Russia itself, Masonic ideas, devoid of the organizational structure of lodges, permeated culture, literature, and philosophy. Masonic symbolism and imagery appeared in the works of Russian writers, often in veiled form, understandable only to the initiated. Even in the architecture and visual arts of the Nikolaevan era, an attentive observer could discover hidden Masonic motifs. One of the most important consequences of the ban on Freemasonry was the formation of new forms of social thought and associations. Masonic lodges were replaced by philosophical circles, literary salons, and scientific societies. It was during this period that two main directions of Russian social thought crystallized: Westernism and Slavophilism. Westernizers, among whom were Timofey Granovsky, Alexander Herzen, Vissarion Belinsky, largely inherited the rationalistic tradition of Enlightenment Freemasonry. They believed in progress, science, and the European path of Russia's development. Their circles, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, became centers of free thinking and criticism of autocracy. The Slavophiles, Alexei Komyakov, the Kireevsky brothers, Konstantin Aksakov, paradoxically also had a connection with the Masonic tradition, but with its mystical Rosicrucian wing. Their doctrine of sobornost, of Russia's special path, of the superiority of the spiritual principle over the rational, resonated with the ideas of the Moscow Martinists of Catherine's era. The Nikolaevan system of state control, for all its rigidity, could not completely eradicate free thinking. The ban on Freemasonry did not lead to the disappearance of free thought, but to its transformation and dispersion. Masonic ideas of brotherhood, equality, and moral improvement penetrated various spheres of public life, preparing the ground for future reforms. Nicholas I, striving to uproot the very seed of revolution, did not understand that ideas cannot be destroyed by prohibitions and persecutions. Driven underground, Freemasonry became even more attractive to young minds seeking an alternative to the official ideology of orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. During this period, a special type of Russian intellectual emerged. A person who opposed the state machine not with weapons in hand, like the Decembrists, but with the power of thought and word. This type, educated in the traditions of philosophical discussions and moral quests, inherited from Freemasonry a belief in the possibility of transforming society through culture and enlightenment. The era of the Great Reforms, which began with the ascension to the throne of Alexander II in 1855, brought with it not only the emancipation of the serfs and the transformation of the judicial system, but also the revival of the Masonic movement in Russia. After a 30-year period of strict prohibitions under the Nikolaevan era, the Freemasons once again found the opportunity to gather, first secretly and then increasingly openly. The liberal spirit of the reforms created a favorable atmosphere for the spread of ideas akin to Masonic ideals. The abolition of serfdom, the zemstvo and judicial reforms, the softening of censorship. All this was perceived by many as the first steps towards transforming Russia along the lines of advanced European powers. It was during this period that Freemasonry began to revive, albeit in forms different from its previous manifestations. Unlike the Catharinian era, when Masonic lodges operated officially and publicly, in the Alexandrian era, Freemasonry acquired a more intimate, private character. Instead of formal lodges with statutes and regulations, friendly circles of like-minded individuals emerged, along with philosophical and literary salons, where Masonic ideas and practices were discussed in an informal setting. One of the centers of revived Freemasonry was the circle of Prince Vladimir Fyodorovich Odoevsky, an outstanding writer, philosopher, and music critic. Odoevsky, whose youth coincided with the Nikolaevan era, remained faithful to Masonic ideals even during the darkest years of reaction. In his Moscow, and later St. Petersburg, home, people interested in esoteric teachings, mystical philosophy, alchemy, and Kabbalah gathered. Odoevsky's salon was visited by many prominent figures of the era: writers, scientists, composers, statesmen. Here, Masonic ideas intertwined with the latest scientific theories, mystical insights with rational analysis of social problems. The host himself, author of the fantastic Russian Nights and numerous philosophical essays, embodied a synthesis of Masonic mysticism and enlightened rationalism. Another important center of Masonic influence was the circle of Count Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy, a poet, playwright, and prose writer. Tolstoy, a cousin of Leo Tolstoy and co-author of the famous Kozma Prutkov, was not only a talented man of letters, but also a person deeply interested in esoteric teachings. In his works, especially in historical novels and dramas, numerous Masonic motifs and symbols can be found. Unlike the politicized Masons of the Decembrist era, Tolstoy and his circle focused on the cultural and spiritual aspects of Freemasonry. They saw in it not a tool for political transformations, but a path to personal improvement and spiritual quest. This apolitical stance allowed them to avoid conflicts with the authorities and concentrate on creativity and philosophical inquiries. A special role in the revival of Masonic ideas was played by the zemstvos, local self-government bodies created during the reforms of Alexander II. The zemstvo movement, which united progressive nobles, raznochinci intelligentsia, and enlightened entrepreneurs, largely embodied the Masonic ideal of public service. Zemstvo figures built schools and hospitals, fought epidemics and famine, created libraries and museums, and all this outside the state bureaucratic system, based on self-organization and mutual assistance. Many leaders of the zemstvo movement had ties to Masonic circles or shared Masonic values, even without being formally initiated. The ideas of public service, enlightenment of the people, moral improvement through practical activity, all this connected the Zemstvo members with the Freemasons. It is no coincidence that the works of Masons of the Catherinian era, especially Nikolai Novikov, with his educational projects, were popular among the Zemstvo circles. The judicial reform of 1864, which created an independent court in Russia, with an adversarial process and trial by jury, also bore the imprint of Masonic influence. Many developers and implementers of this reform, including the famous lawyer Anatoly Fyodorovich Kony, were connected with Masonic circles. The idea of equality of all before the law, regardless of estate and status, was close to the Masonic ideal of brotherhood. During this period, an interesting convergence of Masonic ideas with positivism occurred, a philosophical movement that affirmed the priority of scientific knowledge and social progress. It would seem that rationalistic positivism should have opposed mystical Freemasonry. However, in practice, many positivists, especially in Russia, shared Masonic ethical principles and the ideal of a harmonious society based on reason and justice. An important role in this synthesis of Freemasonry and positivism was played by Russian scientists working abroad, especially in France. It was there, in emigration, that many of them joined Masonic lodges and brought Masonic ideas back to their homeland. For example, the famous sociologist Maxim Kovalevsky, who worked in Paris and London, was an active Mason and contributed to the spread of Masonic ideas in Russian scientific circles. In the field of literature and art, Masonic influence was particularly pronounced. In addition to Dostoevsky and A.K. Tolstoy, already mentioned, Masonic motifs can be found in the works of many outstanding writers of the era. Even an author seemingly far removed from mysticism, like Ivan Turgenev, in his later works addressed themes close to Masonic philosophy, the search for the meaning of life, moral self-improvement, overcoming egoism. In architecture and fine arts, Masonic symbolism penetrated the decoration of public buildings, estates, and even Orthodox churches. Masonic signs, the compass and square, the five-pointed star, the acacia, appeared in the decor, often in a veiled form, understandable only to the initiated. Architects associated with Masonic circles created buildings whose layout and decoration encrypted Masonic ideas of cosmic harmony and divine proportion. The end of the 19th century brought a new breath to Russian Freemasonry, mixing traditional practices with fashionable trends of occultism and esotericism. The era of the Silver Age, with its craving for mystical experience and the search for new spiritual horizons, became fertile ground for the revival of Masonic ideas in a transformed guise. Russia, tormented by political contradictions and social conflicts, yearned not only for social change, but also for spiritual renewal. In the salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow, the names of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner were increasingly heard. The Theosophical Society, founded by Blavatsky in 1875, offered a synthesis of Eastern wisdom and Western occultism, attracting many former Masons who found no satisfaction in traditional religious forms. Blavatsky, a Russian noblewoman who had traveled the world in search of secret knowledge, created a doctrine that largely echoed the esoteric aspects of Freemasonry. Her main work, The Secret Doctrine, was read and discussed in intellectual circles in both capitals. Blavatsky's followers saw in Theosophy a modern continuation of ancient mysteries, to which Masons also traced their lineage. Theosophical circles became a meeting place for people interested in the Masonic tradition, but unable to join official lodges due to ongoing prohibitions. Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, which separated from Theosophy in 1913, also found a fervent response in Russia. Steiner, who developed his own teaching on human spiritual development, attracted many with his synthesis of esoteric Christianity, a scientific approach, and practical methods of spiritual self-improvement. His lectures in Europe were attended by many Russians, from artists and poets to scientists and philosophers. Andrei Bely, one of the greatest symbolist poets, became a convinced anthroposophist, spending several years alongside Steiner in Dornach, where the Anthroposophical Center, the Goetheanum, was being built. He, like many other symbolists, saw in anthroposophy a path to the transformation of man and society, an ideal that linked it with Freemasonry. In his novels The Silver Dove and Petersburg, Bely used images and symbols tracing back to Masonic and Rosicrucian traditions. Symbolism as a literary movement generally proved to be surprisingly consonant with Masonic symbolism and rituals. Symbolist poets Vyacheslav Ivanov, Valery Bryusov, Konstantin Balmont created works rich in esoteric images and illusions. Their work can be seen as a peculiar continuation of the Masonic tradition in circumstances where direct Masonic activity remained prohibited. This connection was particularly evident in the work and philosophy of Vyacheslav Ivanov. His concept of sobornost, spiritual community, the idea of transforming society through art, and the theory of the symbol as a bridge between worlds, all had deep ties to Masonic philosophy. Ivanov's famous his St. Petersburg apartment, where the cream of the Russian intellectual elite gathered, functioned almost like a Masonic lodge, with its atmosphere of selectiveness and initiation into the higher mysteries of art and being. In the early 20th century, formal Masonic organizations also began to appear in Russia, operating semi-legally. Among them, Martinist lodges held a special place, revived in France by Papus, Gérard Encausse, and brought to Russian soil by his disciples. Martinism, tracing its origins to the teachings of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, attracted with its mystical Christianity and emphasis on the inner transformation of man. Count Valerian Valerianovich Muravyov-Amursky, who received permission from Papus to establish Martinist lodges in Russia, founded the Lodge in St. Petersburg in 1910. Its members included writers, artists, officers, and officials, people seeking a spiritual path beyond official religiosity and materialistic science. Martinists studied Kabbalah, alchemy, and astrology, but their main focus was on Christian esotericism and moral self-improvement. Alongside the revival of traditional Masonic forms, numerous pseudo-Masonic organizations also emerged, often with fantastic names and exotic rituals. They attracted people yearning for secrets and wonders in an era when traditional values and beliefs were undergoing a profound crisis. These organizations, having no direct connection with historical Freemasonry, nevertheless contributed to the popularization of Masonic ideas and symbols among broad segments of society. Philosophers of Russian idealism, Vladimir Solovyov, Nikolai Berdyaev, Sergei Bulgakov, Pavel Florensky, though not formally connected with Freemasonry, developed ideas that were largely consonant with Masonic philosophy. Their teachings on sophiology and the idea of God-manhood resonated with the Masonic concept of the unity of all existence and the possibility of human deification through spiritual knowledge. Philosophical societies and circles where these ideas were discussed became peculiar substitutes for Masonic lodges for the intellectual elite. Interest in occultism and esotericism also permeated the artistic environment. Artists of the, quote, group, Alexandre Benoit, Léon Bakst, Nicholas Roerich, used symbolism with Masonic roots in their works. This was particularly evident in Roerich's oeuvre, whose canvases depicting the Himalayas and ancient temples are full of esoteric symbols and allusions to the secret teachings of the East and West. It is noteworthy that during this period, Masonic ideas converged not only with occultism, but also with the latest scientific theories. Concepts nonlinear time, multidimensional space, and the energetic nature of matter, developed by physicists of the early 20th century, resonated with people interested in esoteric teachings. Science and mysticism, which had opposed each other for centuries, began to seek common ground in the Silver Age. This synthesis of science and mysticism was especially evident in the activities of the psychiatrist and psychologist Nikolai Kulbin, who founded the Triangle Society in St. Petersburg. Kulbin, being a doctor and a scientist, was simultaneously interested in occultism and was close to Masonic circles. His theories about the connection between color, sound, and psychological states, and experiments with altered states of consciousness, anticipated many directions in modern psychology and neuroscience. At the turn of the century, a politicization of some Masonic and quasi-Masonic organizations also occurred. While traditional Freemasonry sought to distance itself from direct political activity, new forms of Freemasonry increasingly addressed social and political issues. This was a time when political parties were forming in Russia, constitutional projects were being developed, and the revolutionary movement was growing. Masonic ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity found practical application in the programs of liberal and socialist parties. The beginning of the 20th century was marked by a fundamental turning point in the history of Russian Freemasonry. After the Revolution of 1905, when autocracy first faltered under the pressure of public discontent, a fundamentally new phenomenon began to form in Russia: political Freemasonry. Unlike traditional Masonic organizations focused on spiritual self-improvement and philosophical pursuits, the new lodges set themselves very specific political tasks: the transformation of Russian society and state structure. The Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia, that was the name of this new Masonic organization, created on the model of the French Grand Orient, which had long since abandoned the traditional Masonic requirements of belief in a supreme being and focused on social and political issues. Russian Masons of the new type also moved away from the religious aspects of the teaching, emphasizing political activity and social transformations. The first lodges of political Freemasonry in Russia were founded with the direct participation of French brethren. In the spring of 1908, high-ranking representatives of the Grand Orient of France arrived in St. Petersburg and initiated a group of Russian public figures. Among the first initiates were prominent cadets, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, people who were already actively involved in the political life of the country through legal parties and organizations. The main feature of the new Freemasonry was its non-partisan character. Representatives of various, sometimes ideologically opposing political currents met in the lodges of the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia. Liberals and socialists, moderates and radicals. They were united by a common desire for the democratization of Russia and the limitation of autocracy. Masonic brotherhood became a kind of platform for inter-party dialogue and coordination of opposition actions. Unlike traditional Masonic lodges, with their complex rituals and multi-stage system of initiations, political Freemasonry was organized more simply and pragmatically. Although the basic elements of Masonic rites were preserved, the oath on the sword, special handshakes and passwords, secret signs, the main attention was paid not to the ritual side, but to practical activities. The Masonic network rapidly expanded. By 1909, the lodges of the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia were active not only in the capitals, but also in large provincial cities: Kiev, Odessa, Nizhny Novgorod, Saratov. The total number of the organization, according to various estimates, ranged from 300 to 500 people. These were representatives of the intelligentsia, liberal nobility, industrial and financial bourgeoisie, and officers. Political Freemasonry gained particularly strong positions in the state Duma, where many deputies from opposition parties were connected with Masonic lodges. Through the Duma Tribune, they could legally voice ideas developed at secret Masonic meetings. The Masonic Brotherhood ensured the coordination of actions of various factions when voting on key issues. Among the prominent political Masons of this period were Alexander Kerensky, Nikolai Nekrasov, Mikhail Tereshchenko, Vasily Maklakov, people who would soon play key roles in the events of the February Revolution and the formation of the provisional government. Masonic ties helped them overcome party differences and find compromise solutions. An important feature of the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia was its multi-ethnicity. Unlike traditional Masonic organizations, which often had an elitist and nationally homogeneous character, the new Freemasonry consciously attracted representatives of various peoples of the empire: Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, Georgians, Armenians. This reflected the federalist program of the organization, which envisioned the transformation of Russia into a federation of equal peoples. Political Freemasonry sought to influence not only parliamentary activity, but also public opinion. Many Masons held key positions in the press, publishing houses, universities, and cultural institutions. Through these channels, they disseminated ideas consonant with Masonic principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, preparing public consciousness for impending changes. At the same time, the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia maintained the strictest conspiracy. Members of the organization were not supposed to reveal their affiliation with Freemasonry even to their closest party comrades. Meetings were held in private homes, with all precautions observed. No documentation was kept, decisions were conveyed orally. This allowed them to avoid failures even in the conditions of active work of the Tsarist secret police. Ideologically, Russian political Freemasonry of the early 20th century represented a synthesis of liberalism and moderate socialism. Masons advocated for a constitutional monarchy or a democratic republic, universal suffrage, civil liberties, and social reforms. At the same time, they rejected revolutionary violence, preferring the path of gradual transformations. The February Revolution of 1917 was not a sudden, spontaneous explosion. Beneath the visible chaos of street demonstrations and soldiers' mutinies lay years of meticulous preparation and coordination among various political forces. And here, Masonic structures played the role of an invisible conductor, uniting disparate opposition groups into a single front against the monarchy. On the eve of the revolutionary events, the Masonic lodges of the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia transformed into a veritable shadow parliament, where the strategy and tactics of future transformations were developed. By early 1917, dozens of influential politicians, military figures, entrepreneurs, and journalists were members of Masonic organizations. Among them were Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky, Nikolai Vissarionovich Nekrasov, and Mikhail Ivanovich Tereshchenko, men who would soon lead the provisional government. Masonic connections provided reliable channels of communication between various political forces, from moderate liberals to left-wing socialists. Cadets and socialist revolutionaries, Octobrists and Mensheviks met in the lodges, overcoming party differences for the common goal of overthrowing autocracy. The Masonic Brotherhood created an atmosphere of trust, allowing for frank discussion of even the most radical plans without fear of betrayal or provocations. Military lodges, established among officers of the active army, played a particularly important role. Generals Alexeyev, Ruzsky, and Brusilov, though not formally initiated into Masonry, maintained close contact with Masonic circles through their adjutants and staff officers. These connections ensured the neutrality or even support of the army command during the critical February days, when spontaneous demonstrations, triggered by bread shortages, began in Petrograd on February 23, 1917. The Masonic network immediately activated. Through their representatives in various public organizations, Zemgor, the war industry committees, trade unions, Masons facilitated the transformation of bread riots into a political movement with clear demands for the Tsar's abdication. Alexander Kerensky, a member of the Supreme Council of the Grand Orient of the Peoples of Russia and simultaneously a popular State Duma deputy, played a decisive role in the events. It was Kerensky who became the link between the parliamentary opposition and the rebellious masses. His impassioned speeches before the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison contributed to their defection to the side of the revolution. At the same time, Kerensky skillfully used his Masonic connections to coordinate the actions of various revolutionary centers. Nikolai Nekrasov, another high-ranking Mason, held a key position in the Duma's progressive bloc. He ensured interaction between the Duma factions and the Provisional Committee of the State Duma, which became the embryo of the future provisional government. Masonic communication channels allowed Nekrasov to quickly obtain information about the mood in the army and transmit instructions to revolutionary agitators. Mikhail Tereshchenko, a prominent sugar industrialist and a Mason of high degree, financed revolutionary activities and provided support from industrial circles. His mansion in Petrograd became one of the centers for coordinating revolutionary actions. Later, Tereshchenko would assume the post of Minister of Finance and then Minister of Foreign Affairs in the provisional government. When a delegation from the Provisional Committee of the State Duma arrived in Pskov on March 2, 1917, to negotiate with Nicholas II about his abdication, several Masons were among its members. They acted according to a prearranged plan, convincing the emperor of the inevitability of abdication for the sake of saving the country from civil war. Characteristically, the text of the abdication was drafted with the participation of Masons and contained formulations reflecting the Masonic view of power as service to society. The formation of the provisional government also occurred under strong Masonic influence. Of the 11 ministers in the first composition of the government, at least 5 were Masons, and the rest had close ties to Masonic circles. The chairman of the government, Prince Georgy Lvov, though not formally initiated, shared many Masonic ideals and maintained close relations with the Masonic elite. However, Masonic unity proved short-lived. By the spring of 1917, serious disagreements began to emerge within the provisional government. Kerensky, Nekrasov, and Tereshchenko formed a kind of Masonic triumvirate, striving to pursue a centrist policy, balancing between the demands of the Soviets and the interests of the bourgeoisie. Other Masons in the government leaned either to the right or to the left flank. The first government crisis in April 1917, caused by Milyukov's note on the continuation of the war, demonstrated the limits of Masonic solidarity. Milyukov, who was not part of Masonic structures, was forced to leave the government, while Kerensky, using his Masonic connections, managed to strengthen his own position, becoming Minister of War and Navy. The second government crisis in July 1917 led to the resignation of Prince Lvov and the formation of a second coalition government headed by Kerensky. Masonic influence in the new cabinet further intensified. Nekrasov became Deputy Prime Minister. Tereshchenko retained the post of Foreign Minister. In fact, the Masonic triumvirate took control of the country at a critical moment. However, it was precisely during this period that the influence of the Bolsheviks, who categorically rejected Masonry as a bourgeois undertaking, began to grow rapidly. Lenin and his associates skillfully used the errors of the provisional government, especially the continuation of the unpopular war and the postponement of social reforms, to strengthen their positions among the masses. The Kornilov affair in August 1917 dealt a crushing blow to Masonic influence in power. Although General Kornilov himself was not connected with Masonic circles, many Masons in the government and army sympathized with his desire to establish firm rule. Kerensky, fearing a military dictatorship, was forced to turn to the Bolsheviks for help, which sharply increased their influence and accelerated the fall of the provisional government. After the October Revolution of 1917, the fate of Masonic organizations in Russia came into question. The Bolsheviks, who seized power, officially declared an irreconcilable struggle against Freemasonry, considering it a bourgeois phenomenon and a tool of world capital. Vladimir Lenin repeatedly ridiculed Masonic rituals and called the Freemasons political charlatans. However, reality turned out to be much more complex than simple ideological schemes. Among the Bolshevik leadership, there were many people who had past ties to Masonic organizations. Leon Trotsky, according to some accounts, attended Masonic meetings during his emigration to France. Anatoly Lunacharsky, who became the first People's Commissar of Education, was close to the Theosophical and Anthroposophical circles, which had much in common with Freemasonry. Maxim Litvinov, the future People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, maintained contacts with English Masonic lodges. These connections were not advertised, but also did not become a reason for persecution within the party. The Bolsheviks, being pragmatists, valued professional qualities and loyalty to the new government, not ideological purity. Many former Masons who recognized Soviet power were able to build successful careers in the new conditions, especially in diplomacy and the cultural sphere. One of the most controversial pages in the history of relations between Freemasonry and Bolshevism was the execution of the royal family in Yekaterinburg in July 1918. Many conspiracy theories still circulate around this tragic event, linking the murder of the Romanovs to a Masonic conspiracy. Proponents of this version point to strange inscriptions found on the walls of the Ipatiev house after the execution. Among them were Kabbalistic symbols and a phrase in German, allegedly quoting Heine's poem about King Belshazzar, killed for desecrating sacred vessels. These inscriptions were interpreted as ritualistic signs left by Masonic regicides. However, serious historians are skeptical of this version. The decision to execute the royal family was made by the Bolshevik leadership for purely political reasons. The approach of white forces to Yekaterinburg created a threat of freeing Nicholas II, who could become a banner of the counter-revolution. Yakov Yurovsky, who led the execution, had no known ties to Masonic organizations and acted on direct orders from Moscow. Nevertheless, the symbolic significance of this act cannot be denied. The murder of God's anointed, considered inviolable for centuries, marked a radical break with the traditional order, an idea resonant with the Masonic aspiration to build a new world on the ruins of the old. In this sense, the Bolsheviks, without realizing it, acted in line with the Masonic paradigm of destruction for subsequent creation. After the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks began a systematic struggle against Freemasonry as an ideological opponent. In 1922, a special department was created within the GPU to identify and eliminate Masonic organizations. Many former Masons were arrested and sent to camps. Others chose emigration. In emigration, Russian Freemasonry experienced a true revival. In Paris, Berlin, Harbin, dozens of Russian lodges emerged, uniting representatives of all strata of émigré society, from former aristocrats to ordinary white army officers. These lodges became not only a place of spiritual communication, but also centers of mutual aid, cultural, and political activity. Paradoxically, many ideas of early Bolshevism, internationalism, equality, brotherhood of all workers, had clear parallels with Masonic ideals. Soviet symbolism, the five-pointed star, the hammer and sickle as symbols of creative labor, also echoed Masonic emblemology. Even the cult of Lenin, which developed after his death with the mausoleum as a central element, resembled the Masonic tradition of honoring past masters. These parallels were not accidental. Bolshevism, like Freemasonry, offered a universal model for reshaping the world based on rational principles. Both ideologies appealed to the idea of chosenness. Masons saw themselves as guardians of secret knowledge, Bolsheviks as the vanguard of the proletariat, leading humanity to a bright future. However, a fundamental contradiction existed between Freemasonry and Bolshevism. Freemasonry, despite its revolutionary potential, remained an elitist movement, focused on the gradual transformation of society through the moral improvement of individuals. Bolshevism, on the other hand, relied on mass revolutionary action and the dictatorship of the party as a tool for radical change. By the end of the 1920s, Freemasonry in Soviet Russia was almost completely destroyed. The last underground lodges ceased to exist during the Great Terror of 1937–38, when even those former Masons who loyally served the Soviet government were repressed. The history of relations between Freemasonry and Bolshevism shows how revolutionary ideas, originating in secret societies of the educated elite, can transform into a mass movement with entirely different goals and methods. Masons dreamed of a harmonious society of equal opportunities. The Bolsheviks tried to build it through violence. The result was far from the ideals of both movements. 2 centuries of Masonic presence in Russia left a deep mark on national culture, philosophy, and political thought. Like an invisible thread, Masonic ideas permeate the works of great Russian writers and thinkers. From Pushkin and Tolstoy to Blok and Bulgakov, many classics of Russian literature were either Masons themselves or were influenced by Masonic philosophy. In their works, we find Masonic symbols, allegories, and moral concepts, often hidden from the uninitiated reader. Masonic influence is particularly noticeable in Russian architecture of the 18th and 19th centuries. Estates and mansions commissioned by noble Masons contain characteristic elements: rotundas symbolizing the Temple of Solomon, Egyptian and Greek motifs, and sacred geometry in the layout of parks and gardens. Even in Orthodox churches of that period, an attentive eye can spot Masonic symbols: the all-seeing eye, pentagrams, and bees as a symbol of industriousness. In Russian philosophical thought, the Masonic legacy manifested itself in Vladimir Solovyov's concepts of all unity, Nikolai Berdyaev's idea of God-manhood, and Sergei Bulgakov's Sophiology. These thinkers, though not formally Masons, developed ideas consonant with the Masonic understanding of a harmonious synthesis of the spiritual and material, and the possibility of transforming man and society through moral improvement. After 70 years of Soviet prohibition, with the fall of the communist regime, Freemasonry returned to Russia. In the 1990s, lodges of various Masonic systems, the Grand Orient of France, the Grand Lodge of England, the Scottish Rite, were opened in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major cities. Many of these were founded with the participation of Russian emigrant Masons, who had preserved the traditions in exile. Modern Russian Freemasonry strives to revive historical traditions, but faces serious difficulties. On one hand, Society maintains a wary attitude towards secret societies, fueled by conspiracy theories and anti-Masonic propaganda. On the other hand, Freemasonry itself is experiencing an identity crisis, trying to define its place in a world where traditional values and institutions are undergoing radical revision. The paradox of the current situation is that Masonic ideas of equality, fraternity, and tolerance, once considered revolutionary, are now perceived by many as conservative. In the postmodern era, which denies universal truths and hierarchical structures, Freemasonry, with its rituals, degrees of initiation, and moral code, appears anachronistic. At the same time, it is precisely this fidelity to tradition that attracts people seeking stable guidelines in a rapidly changing world to Masonic lodges. Modern Russian Masons are predominantly representatives of the intelligentsia, business, and creative professions, striving for spiritual and moral self-improvement outside the framework of official religious institutions. In public consciousness, Freemasonry remains surrounded by myths and stereotypes. For some, it is a secret world government. For others, a harmless interest club. For still others, a guardian of esoteric knowledge. Historical research of recent decades is gradually debunking the most fantastic theories, showing the real role of Freemasonry in Russian history, significant but not omnipotent. The Masonic trace in Russian history is not so much about political conspiracies and revolutions as it is about the transformation of the elite's consciousness, the gradual introduction of ideas of humanism, enlightenment, and civil society. Masonic lodges became the first islands of civil society in Russia, spaces of freedom where people of different estates and beliefs could communicate as equals, discussing philosophical and social issues without regard for official ideology. The two-century path of Russian Freemasonry, from Peter the Great's reforms to the Bolshevik Revolution, shows how ideas that originated in a narrow circle of the intellectual elite gradually penetrated broad layers of society, transformed, and ultimately changed the country's historical trajectory. In this sense, the history of Freemasonry is a history of ideas, their dissemination and embodiment in social reality. Today, as Russia is once again at a historical crossroads, the experience of Freemasonry can be useful for understanding the mechanisms of social and cultural changes. The Masonic ideal of a harmonious combination of tradition and progress, spirituality and rationality, personal freedom and public good remains a relevant challenge for modern Russian society, seeking its path between the extremes of nationalism and globalism, authoritarianism and anarchy.